Good morning. It is a pleasure for the Spiritist Society of the Carolinas to welcome everyone to our annual Spiritist Conference in the Carolinas.
We have a faith that this beautiful venue has been blessed by God. Likewise, we would like to thank you, God, Jesus Christ, and good spirits for trusting us to do this Spiritism conference in Charlotte.
Our heart goes to the spirit of Dante Labate and full gratitude in working tirelessly to disseminate Spiritism nationally and internationally.
Now, I want to invite all of you to keep yourselves in higher elevated thoughts, gracious and fraternal social integration. We hope you enjoy this beautiful and blessed venue on this beautiful Sunday.
Please join us for the opening prayer.
Please close your eyes. We pray to Almighty Lord God to send the good Spirit to assist us in this venue. Amen. Amen. Open your eyes. What if that is not the end? What if that is more after that? We will have a conversation about the extent scientific proof for life after life, and now certainly of a future life can change how we behave in this world.
About our Spiritist speaker guest, Dr. Dan
Assisi.
Holds a doctorate degree in education and master's in public administration from the University of Southern California. He lives in San Diego and speaks on the spirituality and Spiritism in the United States and internationally.
Welcome, Dr. Daniel Assisi.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate you being here on a Sunday. I know very well that you could be doing other things with your time, and especially in this beautifully nice and crisp weather, the call of your blankets speaks very loud, so I am appreciative of your attention and of your time here today. We have a curious format, and I feel like I might want to mention a couple of things about the format of today so that you're more aware of what's going on. We are going to break this presentation into two parts, two 1-hour parts. I know it's a very long commitment. And during that and halfway through the middle, we might just pause a little bit and kind of keep on going, if that makes sense to you. I just want to make sure you know what you're getting into before you do it. I also want to let you know that it would not bother me at all if you stand up and if you walk around, because I know it's a very long time. So feel free to, as a friend of mine has described, pull your own happiness wagon for the day. Does that make sense so far? Mm-hmm. And I hope that in the end we might have as well some time to interact a little bit and ask questions and maybe some comments, and I'll make myself available as well, even if you run out of time. So thank you again. Today's question is, what if death is not the end? You see, that's a really powerful question, I feel, for the days that we live in, because our society seems to be consumed with the idea of not dying, of prolonging life for as long as we can. We do many different things, even surgical procedures, Botox, all to make sure that we remain constantly young. And while I am not criticizing that whatsoever, because we believe people should be able to do what they please and respect their free will, the question that comes to our mind is, what's so wrong with aging? And are we prepared to face the certainty that we have that all of us, at one point in time, will no longer be in this physical body? And that, I feel, is where Spiritism has a lot to add, because it tells us a lot about what is to come. But I also feel that our society sort of stops there. We just don't talk about death. We just don't talk about what's after death, if there's anything at all. And that sends a message many times that death is the end of things. But it's not. And the next question that you can ask me then is, but then how do you know? Well, I think that there's different ways in which we can look at it, scientifically speaking. So today we hope to go over a couple of these scientific proofs and some of these studies that have been going on for a while that lead us to the idea that death is a certainty, but that life after death is even a greater certainty. But to be honest with you, what I'm most interested in is not only the scientific proofs, but if there is life after death, then what does that mean to our current life? Does that mean we face our life differently than we did before? Does that mean that we make perhaps different choices than we have before? Does it mean that we behave differently? Perhaps are we kinder to other human beings because we will have more time together? We don't have to compete so much for resources and things. So a couple of considerations that we are going to entertain. And I'm also going to ask for your indulgence to sneak in a slightly different topic on top of this. Well, sort of. I also want to talk about this new epidemic that we have, suicide. And I feel the idea of the afterlife and life after life also addresses this growing problem that we have seen in our society, where more and more we find people taking their lives because they believe that there is nothing after this life and that will end their suffering. But if there is something after this life, then maybe their suffering doesn't end when they take their lives as well. So we also want to briefly talk about that and then go through the process. Now, I should warn you, my brain is very scattered, so we are going to go in many different places today. And I hope that you bear with me. I hope that it will make sense to you. And I hope that at the end you have some extra resources that you can consult on your own and explore more the topic, because I am fully cognizant that I will not change your mind or I will not convince you to do anything, because nobody really does. My job here, I feel, is to provide you with some furnishings, some resources, some books, some places to look, that should you find the interest to look further, you can. So far, so good? All right. So thank you again. We're going to go through this, and we want to frame things a little bit. So I want to start by talking about this suicide problem, and eventually we're going to get to those scientific proofs that we were talking about. So what is the problem? Well, suicide is a really big problem in our country and in the whole world, but specifically in the United States. 42,773 is the number. It's a number that we want to address, because that is the number of deaths by suicide in the US in 2014, according to the American Foundation of Suicide Prevention. That's a large number, and sometimes we struggle to put numbers in context. So let me try to do that a little bit. 42,000 people have decided and have taken their lives by themselves in that year. That means that 5 people every hour commit suicide. So if you think about it this way, we are going to spend 2 hours together here. That's going to be broken into different sections. By the time that we have done our conversation here today, 10 people will have taken their lives, which is a sizable number of people. And if you look around the room and just count chairs, you can visualize the impact of those decisions, which are very permanent decisions to temporary problems. So it's quite a big problem. And in fact, I am really worried about it in general. And sometimes whenever I can, I like to talk about this, because the rates are increasing, the rates of suicide. And I want to show you some numbers over here, if my computer doesn't act up today, which probably will. But see this little blue line that's going on over there? Well, that blue line shows the ratio of suicides per 100,000 individuals. And why do they do it this way? Because population naturally increases, so it's only natural that the number of suicide increases with time because the population also grows. So the way that they keep it constant is they divide that by 100,000 so that they see if the number is increasing at a higher rate than it should. And ever since 2005, you can see a steady gain. So not only are we increasing the number of suicides, but we're also increasing at a faster rate than population growth, which is a big problem. In fact, it's the 10th highest cause of death in the US today. It's very large. And for boys between 18 and 35, it's the 4th largest cause. It's an incredibly poignant and present situation. And to make matters even more difficult, there are 25 attempts for every suicide. So imagine the sheer number of attempts and things that are happening. And I say that not to bring us down, but for us to be aware that it's very likely that we know somebody who's struggling with this. They might not have openly talked to you about it, but somebody that you know has either thought of or has attempted suicide. And it's a very serious problem, and I hope that as we talk about this, we'll destigmatize some of the concepts that we bring with us as it relates to suicide. And maybe we can be more readily available to help those who may be in need. And maybe just by being aware of that, in general, the problem, we might be better suited to look for the signs of that on our own in our lives in general. But anyways, what really is interesting about this whole piece is it's the idea that having known people who have attempted suicide, that it's oftentimes an attempt to escape their own pain. I can tell you a story, if you like, of a friend that I know of work. In September of 2017, I received a call from one of my colleagues at work who had asked me, "Have you seen Andre's Facebook page?" And I thought, no, I was in the middle of a couple of deadlines. I was busy with many different things. Why should I be looking at his Facebook page? My mind automatically went, did Andre, who was always a great guy and very thoughtful, did he put something that was perhaps not very nice on Facebook? Is this become an HR issue of sorts, or are we going to have to talk to somebody about something? And I thought that was a nuisance, really. But she told me, no, you need to look at Andre's page. And I went to Facebook, and we were friends on Facebook, and I saw that on his Facebook page, he had left a will. And he also had left the songs that he would like to have been played at his funeral. At which point we were really worried about where was Andre and what was he doing. So I attempted to call him to no avail. Many of our other folks on our team as well attempted to call him as well, and we could not get a hold of him. And at that point we became certain that something was off, that something was not good. So we text messaged him as well, and fortunately, by the miracle of technology, I could see that my messages were being delivered and were being read, but they were not being responded. So it brought some hope, and because we're all on business account phones at our organization, on cell phones on a business account, I called the provider and said, hey, I want you to track this cell phone. I want you to tell me where it is, which they could not do legally. And so we triggered the police and a search for Andre and where he was, and went on. Fast forward to 6-7 hours later, Andre was eventually found. He was alive. He was in San Francisco, even though he lived in Sacramento. He had been so thoughtful as to think about where he should die, because he didn't want to bother those around him. So he had driven a couple of hours to San Francisco, and he was in a restaurant near a cliff where he was planning to take his own life. We were very fortunate that he was found, and there were a series of circumstances in his life that had recently changed, from a new relationship, breaking up an old relationship, and all kinds of different things that led him into that piece. But was interesting is that, we were able to get Andre some help. He went to a hospital. He received psychiatric care, and he exited, and he was supported, which was lovely. But the truth is that about 2 months later, it happened again. He attempted one more time to take his life, and one more time we were able to find him and talk to him and spend some time with him on the phone while the police was knocking to his home and getting to him on time. Why do I say that? I say that because Andre had shown no indications whatsoever to any of us that he was in trouble, that he felt that way. In fact, Andre was the person that people went to when they were feeling blue and needed somebody to talk to. And he was always there helping others. And it's surprising in many different ways that this came in such a manner that he went past unnoticed by most of us at work, which triggered our own individual challenges and our own need for self-reflection and our own need for counseling for a bunch of folks who were thinking, how could this happen? And they felt hurt and lots of different emotions. I say that to mention that an incident like an attempt does not only affect the life of those who attempt it, but also those who are around them. So it's a social problem. It's a group problem. It's not just a problem of whoever is having those thoughts. And so it's very important for us to think about this. And having had a chance to talk to Andre many times and address these issues and ask him like, what's going on? A certainty has come to me and to other folks as well, and not only because we talked to Andre, but in general, is that people who are looking into taking their own lives are not doing it because they want necessarily to end their life. They want to do it because they want to end their suffering. And they believe that if they are able to end their lives, they will end their suffering, right? And in different ways, it guides sort of our thinking today, because I do want to talk a little bit about the intellectual causes and the emotional causes of suffering, so that we can think about it. And then I hope that we can apply then our scientific mindset and the scientific proofs that we have to see if they bring any solace to what we are trying to address, which is not only the certainty that life lives after life, that we live on after this life, but that there's also a lot of purpose and meaning for us to be had here as well. So there are emotional causes for suffering, and there are intellectual causes for suffering. It's often the case, though, in my experience, that we see that the emotional causes for suffering are the ones that really get us. The intellectual causes for suffering, understanding that the situation is not great, they happen as well, but generally they were taken by strong emotions and strong feelings that sometimes our intellect knows not to be true, but we feel them anyways. So it's important for us to address those, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well. But if you're with me so far, still, and you haven't slept, which I'm thankful for, and I should say, I don't know if you noticed in the opening screen, there was a picture of a table and there was some coffee on the top left corner. That was on purpose. Some caffeine there for you. Studies have shown that if you think about drinking coffee, it has almost the same effect as actually drinking coffee. So whenever you feel like you're tired because it will be a long day, make sure that you make yourself available to have a virtual sip of coffee, and maybe that will perk you up a little bit. We got to pull our own happiness wagon, people. It's going to be a long day, so thank you for being here. But all right, so all of this is really about suffering. It's really about pain, and I think that is one certainty that we all have. We all go through and struggle with suffering at one point in time in our lives, or frequently, actually. In fact, it can be said that at any point in time, we're all fighting a war that nobody knows about, because oftentimes we don't talk about it. But I was interested in understanding, where does pain and suffering come from? And one of the best ways that I have found to explain that to myself and understand the cause and suffering of pain has not come through modern psychologists, has actually come from an ancient psychologist that I call Siddhartha Gautama, or the Buddha. the Buddha's work is an extremely psychological-minded work that I feel aligns very well with Spiritism in many different ways. And I want to talk a little bit about it because Buddha has a wonderful teaching that's called the Four Noble Truths that are very relevant to us because they are really, in my perspective, a whole philosophy about life and suffering and why we suffer. So if you have the patience with me here, I want to make sure that we talk about this this picture because it will come handy. All right, and I find my cursor. Look at that. So it's not going to work today, but okay. So the story goes that Buddha, the enlightened one, Siddhartha Gautama, was a prince, son of a powerful king who loved his son so much as to try to protect him from anything the world had that was not pleasant. So the tradition goes that Buddha, until a very late age, had not left the palace. In fact, he was not allowed to see sick people or anything else. He was only allowed to see the best possible thing. Also because there was some sort of oracle that had predicted that the son would either become a very wise king or a very wise monk. And the parent wanted to nudge his son towards becoming a king because this monk stuff is probably not very good when you're king, right? Because you can have monks if you want to, but as a king you have everything. So he tried to protect his son, and then eventually, at the age of 18, I believe, he convinces his father to let him go outside of the palace for a stroll. And he does that with one of his friends, which you see there also close to, this is Buddha over here, and you see him with his friend over there, who's riding with him on a chariot. And the interesting piece about this is that during that trip outside the palace, Buddha is exposed, Siddhartha, I should say, he's not yet the Buddha. He's exposed to different things. And the first one that he's exposed to is, let's see here. Let's try it again, one more time. Okay, maybe I'll get there one day. All right, let's see. All right, so as he goes out, the first sight that he sees is of you can't see back here, but is of a handicapped person, somebody with a physical handicap. And he asks his friends, what is that? Because he has never seen such a thing. And his friends explains to him, it is somebody who has some challenges, some physical challenges. And so he said, so the tradition goes that he remained silent because he was surprised. Later on, he sees a second sight. And the second sight is of somebody who is ill over here. And he asks his friend too, what is that? Because he had never seen illness. It's in the bottom left corner there for you, or bottom right corner there for you as well. And he's also surprised, and that's his second sight during that trip. Eventually, he goes a little further and he has his third sight. And the third sight is of a dead body. And he asks his friends, what is that? Because he had never seen that either. And his friend diligently and carefully explains to him that is the corpse. That's the corpse. That's the body of somebody who has passed away. And he continues in meditation. And then he has a fourth sight. And he sees a monk who is meditating and seems to be happy. And the tradition goes, and then he has an awareness. And he comes into meditation later on and develops what Buddhists and the like now call Four Noble Truths, which I found to be a treatise on suffering in life in general. And if you give me a couple of more minutes, I hope this makes sense. Basically, the Four Noble Truths that we find in Buddhism have come from Buddha, state that life is dukkha. And dukkha is a Sanskrit word for suffering and challenges, really. Life is a constant trial and challenges of things that we got to figure out. That's his first certainty that he figured out when he saw all of that happen. And here's where comes the genius of Buddha, I think. The noble truth number 2 is that dukkha, or this suffering, this struggle, the strife, comes from attachment to impermanent things. If you attach your happiness to things that are going to fade away and go away, things that do not last, you are bound to suffer. If you put all your happiness into your car, brand new car, or your house, or whatever you have, and you know that those things are going to go away, you are setting yourself up for suffering. Because we know that those things will break, they will vanish, they will shy away, they will disappear, they will be stolen, whatever it is. Those things that can be taken away from you will set you up for pain and suffering. So it's a clear statement, simple one, that almost makes me mad because it's so simple and so clear and yet so powerful. I'm like, I wish I could describe things that way, right? But it's a very powerful thing. So attachment to impermanent things, it's bound to leave us suffering. But he goes on, and his third noble truth is that if you eliminate attachment, you can reach this level of what they call nirvana or bliss or not suffering. So if we can focus our minds on things that are permanent by nature, then we're in business. Then we can avoid all the suffering. And he goes further and he says that the liberation, that doing this, comes from the Eightfold Path, which is a separate thing. It's like 8 things that you should think, like, the right thought process, the right work, the right focus, and everything else, which is really, really interesting. But I find that very interesting in many different ways because as a Christian, I find this perfectly aligns with some other messages that I have heard of the Christ, who says that happiness is not of this world, right? And that you should not, that your treasure is where your heart is, and that you should not put your heart in places where iron can rust and moth can take it away. So while Buddha tells us how to not suffer, Jesus, I think, points us toward how to be happy by putting our heart in things of the spirit, because those are permanent, because the spirit lasts, but the physical body does not. So I think that's an interesting perspective that Buddha offers us when it comes to this piece, because it starts to give some insight on why is it that we suffer. We suffer because we want things that are going to be taken away from us. If we were only able to like the things that cannot be taken away from us, then we would never be let down. If we were to focus on our virtues, on our qualities, and that of others, none of that can be taken away from us. So we would never be disappointed. And it's also very important to say that happiness here, even in this piece, it's an interesting one because it tells us that attachment to anything that's impermanent, even relationships. Even though we don't think about this, we generally think about material things being permanent, but attachment to other people is also potentially a permanent thing because they too are going to go away. So if our happiness is predicated on somebody else making us happy, we are also in trouble because when they pass, and they will, we will suffer too. So we have to be happy and content and reach our own nirvana by our own accord. Of course, we can share that with others, but nobody can give us happiness. We have to acquire that of ourselves, which is an important piece to everything that we're talking about, suicide, but also our life in general. So I find that very interesting. Okay, so we did a little tangent here. We talked a little bit about life after death. We talked a little bit about the challenge of suicide that we face today. We talked a little bit about a personal story to kind of illustrate the point, and also we visited, lo and behold, the Buddha, who 25 plus 100 years ago was already onto something special. But nowadays, with our modern world, we also want to ask ourselves in this time and place, if there are other pieces that may give us certainty as to life after life. And you might see there, if you can see it, that I put a little brain there and I put a little heart there because I think that we need to, again, address the intellectual causes of suffering and the emotional causes for suffering. We are going to focus now a little bit on the intellectual solutions to the problem of what if there is no death? So let's look at some of the ways in which we thought of that could give us some solace and some certainty as to the fact that when we shed this mortal coil, as Shakespeare described in Hamlet, as we leave this behind, we will be able to move on. As we find in Hamlet, like what dreams may come, right? So here we go. I have 5 different areas which I want to bring to you today. If you have the stamina and the coffee in you, to talk about the evidence of life after life, and also we don't talk about this very much, but life before life. Because if we have also existed before we come into the physical body, then it's basically the same thing. We have existed outside of our physical body, and so we also have the capacity to exist beyond. And there's 6 different areas. One of them is spontaneous memories of past lives. The second one is memory regression. The third one is NDEs, near-death experiences. The fourth one is ITCs, or instrumental transcommunication. And the fifth and the sixth one are mediumship. And I know that you can see there's 4, but I'm really counting spiritist mediumship and spiritualist mediumship as separate pieces because they're slightly different. We'll talk about that. But there really are 6 different areas there in general that we can kind of investigate. Are you ready? This is the more like thick part of our conversation today. We're going to try to make it as pleasant and non-boring as possible. All right, so let's start with spontaneous memories. And this is the case in which there are studies done about people who, without being prompted, remember their past lives. They have memories of places they have never been before, of being a different person, being a different family, and they are able to explain historical events that they could not have known in advance, right? And it's a really interesting piece because how could they possibly know about this other lives and this other events if they have not lived that before, if they don't know anybody who's in contact with that? It's a very curious thing that raises many different questions. It's not that common, but it's not that uncommon either, right? And one of the greatest exponents when it comes to that is Dr. Ian Stevenson, who passed away in 2007 at the ripe age of 88, I believe. And Dr. Ian Stevenson, this is what's really interesting about his study, I think. He founded the division, it's a very long sentence right in the corner, I'm going to read it with you, take a breath. He founded the Division of Perceptual Studies in the Psychiatric Medicine Department of the University of Virginia. And that was in 1967. So we're talking about real academic research in a recognized university in 1967, right? So he was studying these cases, and he has tons of academic research on these spontaneous memories. And he's got an emphasis in the cases of young children with birthmarks related to previous lives. He's got thousands of records, more than 3,000 records on different cases, or 3,000 different cases that he has documented. And what I find fascinating here is that in his approach, he decided to focus whenever he could on children. Because children, according to his perception, were less likely to try to game the system, so to speak. They were less likely to be able to maintain a ruse or really kind of lie to the researchers. So we're talking about children who are before 5 years old, right? And 6. And then after that, he noticed that they started forgetting about their previous lives. And so he goes into different places, and a lot of it was into like India. He would go into faraway urban areas of India where some families would say that their kids are remembering this life, and they would not have the means because they're so poor to drive hours away to other regions to kind of check onto that stories. And so he does that, and he interviews the other people over there, and he documents all these cases along with a team, which is a fascinating read. And he has written a couple of books, and I put them down here in case you ever want to kind of check them out. 20 cases suggestive of reincarnation, which he published in 1974, was his first one. It was a big milestone because it's quite a while ago, and kind of maps out 20 cases, that for him were very strong about the whole process. And it's very interesting read in general. The challenge is that it's academic reading, so it's not necessarily the most exciting page-turning bestseller, right? But it is interesting for that matter, because it's really some academic folks trying to make some unbiased expositions around the phenomena and the data that they have acquired in the field. And it's fascinating. It's really fascinating. And he's done it for more than 40 years before he passed. And now we have Dr. Tucker, who still works at the University of Virginia, carrying on those studies as well. And it's really interesting. He produced a couple more books after that, Children Who Remember Previous Lives and so forth. And it's an interesting read if you have the desire and the inclination, because he points us to exactly that. He points us to this way of looking at data and things. So what I also find curious is that in many different cases, it doesn't mean necessarily that it is so, according to the Spiritist view, but in many different cases, some young children had some birthmarks, and when they had their memories, about the previous lives, that birthmark related to their death. There was a kid, for instance, who had a birthmark in there, and right here over the heart, and he remembered actually being shot at point blank range in the previous life when he was a police officer in a neighboring village. Some curiosities in general that are very interesting in many different ways. In both ways, both because it raises an eyebrow, but because it's also interesting. But it does not mean in any way that your birthmarks, by the way, people, are a result of previous lives. That's not what we're saying at all, or that you have birthmarks at all. I don't want to know. But my point here is that it's interesting to see the degree of detail that they go into and the hours and the time that they have spent trying to analyze all of this and make sense of all these things. Does that make sense with so far? So if you find it interesting, and if you're interested in the idea of spontaneous memories, Ian Stevenson's probably the name on the field that you might want to investigate and chase down. And if you have the proclivity for some academic reading, you might want to entertain some of his titles that are voluminous in many different ways, but nevertheless are easy to find by the miracle of Amazon and the bookstore near you, right? So, and the really interesting thing about Ian Stevenson is that he conducted all this research, and he never had the audacity, I should say, of thinking that he was able to convince other people that reincarnation was a legit thing. He knew that that a lot of people already believe in reincarnation and don't necessarily lead a better life, right? If you think about it, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, we even have found as humanity a way of using reincarnation to condemn people to certain social classes, as we sometimes find that in India. So the belief in reincarnation itself, it's not necessarily a sign of evolution, because it can also be manipulated to keep people in an oppressive state, so to speak. I'm not making a criticism, I'm just making an observation. I hope sure that we understand that. So I thought that he was very wise in entertaining the idea that a lot of people might come across research and still decide that there was not enough evidence. And I think in that way, it's the same thing that we do here today. We don't have the presumption that this is going to change your mind, but we do want to give you some resources to look into. All right. So let's move on to Carol Bauman. Still in the field of spontaneous memories, and Carol Bauman, who I had the pleasure of meeting a couple of times in a couple of events, fantastic, very nice person, and she published a book called Children's Past Life in 1997, and also Return from Heaven. You see those covers back here. The good thing about Carol Bauman is that her books are not academically written. They are really a lot more accessible and easy to read. And her story is really interesting. I should have prefaced this by saying that she is an internationally known author now, lecturer, counselor, past life regression therapist, and a pioneer in reincarnation studies. And she was one of the first known academic book publishers or authors to explore this phenomena of children's spontaneous past life memories, mainly because one of her children spontaneously recalled past lives, and she was both scared and surprised by it at first, but pursued that anyways, because as a counselor and then as a mom, obviously you take some special interest when you hear your kid saying interesting things. We have some stories there to tell, but perhaps for another time. But from her personal experience with that, she got into the field and also followed the research of obviously Dr. Ian Stevenson, whom we mentioned before. So in many different ways, Carol does a really great job, or I should say, Spallman, has done a really great job of breaking down Ian Stevenson's academic research for the rest of us who might not be entertained by some heavy reading, some heavy academic reading on a Friday night, right? Not that you may not be, yes, I'm saying that sometimes I'm not, right? I think that Dr. Ian Stevenson's book is not the one that you say, oh, goody, I'm going to stay in the Friday night and just go through these 500 pages of really exciting reading. I haven't heard anybody say that to me yet, but maybe you'll prove me wrong. Who knows? But anyways, the interesting piece here is that Carol also had her personal experiences with her own children and sought out what was happening to them and came across Dr. Ian Stevenson and was able to then not only document some of that, but also share with us some of her previous experiences with parents and children who recall different lives. You might have heard a while back on TV, we had a case, for instance, of a young kid who recalled being an aircraft carrier pilot during World War II. That was one of her clients as well, that she kind of helped figure things out. I think you can actually Google that and find that story. It's an entertaining one. It's actually a very interesting one because these kids go into incredible detail on things that nobody knows. Even their former family, so to speak, don't necessarily know the details until they're reminded of that. So unconsciously, right? I mean, even consciously, they couldn't possibly give in that information because they didn't know or didn't remember that themselves. It's a fascinating piece that really kind of throws a wrench in our thought process, right? And say, oh my goodness, how can that possibly happen? And the most logical and shortest explanation is reincarnation. I mean, you can come up with many different ways. You can see that you can say, well, the kid was reading somebody else's thoughts, right? But that also seems more absurd than the concept of reincarnation. We end up creating greater excuses to deny something that we don't want to accept than to perhaps be faced with what is right in front of us. But I digress anyway. But it's a very interesting perspective in general that is interesting for us to kind of mention, especially when the kid or the families don't have access to each other, right? And then you ask, well, if you're reading each other's thoughts, which is already a big leap, how would you selectively read the thoughts of somebody who's thousands of miles away from you and not somebody right beside you? Right? So you run into problems, and that's when we leverage Occam's razor, the concept in philosophy that tells us that the simplest explanation is most likely the true one, and the simplest explanation is right in front of us in that case. So if you are interested in spontaneous memories, then we've given you two names, Dr. Ian Stevenson and Carol Bauman. And this is when we shift gears to the next area. Are you ready? All right, so here we go. We now go into memory regression. So that's slightly different than spontaneous memories. These are memories who are arrived at because there was some probing, right? And I think all of us might be familiar with the name of Brian Weiss, who wrote a bestseller called Many Lives, Many Masters in 1988. And Dr. Brian Weiss is known for his bestsellers about cases of memory regression to previous existence during past life therapy. And it's a memory regression therapy for trauma. So what really interesting about his work here is he narrates to us. He, as a counselor, as a therapist, would oftentimes deal with cases of great trauma. And his training had led them to revert back to their childhood so that they could unearth that trauma. And that by relieving that trauma and understanding what it is, they could have this emotional release and do it. And so he was been doing that for years. And he would put his patients under sort of hypnosis and get them deep into it, and then direct them to go back to their childhood, and that's how we do it. But to his surprise, one fine day, he found that one of his patients actually went beyond childhood and start narrating to him his previous life and saying, I am now a body of a woman or of a different gender, and I'm walking the streets in this city, and I'm seeing this, and he's surprised. He's like, what? Right? I think that's not exactly what you're expecting. You're expecting to go back to childhood and try to live those memories, and all of a sudden, your patient's telling you that they are in a different body, in a different time, in a different place, facing different challenges which related to their traumas. And he agonized over that, but he treated those traumas as he would otherwise have, and they have also moved the patients forward. And then he started realizing that more and more of his patients, if product could go that route. And so what you have is you have a couple of books there. You have Many Lives, Many Masters, and Same Soul, Many Bodies, in which he describes then this process of regression, that guided regression that actually goes beyond this physical life, which might be quite a surprise, right? Especially as the initial patients, as they probably didn't sign up for that. I jest, but not really. Like, it might really have been something quite interesting. So if you're interested in reading about those cases, the books of Dr. Brian Weiss, they are very easy to read. They are not academic books. They are really accounts. Of course, he protects the names of those people involved, but you can read about the cases in general and see how interesting it is. And it is very interesting, and you get a bunch of them, and you kind of start seeing a pattern there of trauma and everything else. We can talk more about memory regression, because there's generally questions about memory regression whenever we talk about this, because people always want to know what they were in previous lives. And I think it's fascinating because everybody wants to find out what great personality in history they were, right? They never want to find out that they were a maid, right, somewhere. They're really looking for something amazing, which is not that amazing if you think about it, because some of the historical figures have not necessarily done us a great job. But anyways, I say that because that's probably questions that we can entertain later. We often talk as well about I think there's a really good reason for why we don't remember our past lives, so that we don't carry on with us the trauma and our bias towards people that might be around today that may have had different roles in our lives in times bygone. But anyways, I don't want to editorialize right now. I just want to remind you that the works of Brian Weiss are there. If you like to read more about it, that's something that you can do. I always get the question of, hold on a second, I want to take a picture of your screen sometimes. You don't need to. Talk to me later, give you a link. You can see this online and you can pick it up. But it's very easy. But sure, take all the pictures if you want. If you want to write it down, not that you would either. There's not going to be a quiz. Don't worry, right? But anyways, Brian Weiss and memory regression. Are you okay so far? Check in with you. Remember that if you want to walk around, take a break, you can always do that. All right, so we go on still to memory regression. And now we introduce the work of Dr. Michael Newton, who published Journey of Souls in 1994. And Dr. Michael Newton utilized regression as well to investigate past life traumas, and also study cases of patients with memories of events in between lives. This is why I'm mentioning Dr. Newton here, because I think it's very interesting. Much the same way Dr. Brian Weiss, he regressed patients and accidentally they started going back to previous lives. But with him, he started also noticing something else, that not only were the patients regressing to past lives, but the patients were also remembering some things in between lives when they did not have a physical body. What? Right? What? Right? I mean, the memory regression to past lives is an implicit thing. Like, well, if you have lived a previous life, then your consciousness has survived that experience and has somehow find its way back into another body, right? And still the same consciousness, with a minor hard drive wipeout, right? To kind of reset you for the technically inclined in the room. But this is very interesting because this is a memory of a consciousness that does not have a body. So there's some narration about preparing oneself to come into a new body and how the process was. It's a little fuzzy, but very interesting in general. And if you want to read more about that, we can point you to his book Journey of Souls in 1994, and the next one called Destiny of Souls that can also be found really easily on web and in many different bookstores in general, which are always very interesting because if you think that the memory regression is an area that might provide you with more information on some of this interesting process that we are going through of looking into scientific proofs that life exists after the physical body, that's something that you might want to investigate. Especially because one thing that we sometimes forget to kind of mention, or it doesn't sink in, is that one of the things that scientifically speaking that we want to see is this repetition, right? We want to see somebody doing something and somebody else also being able to do that very same something. If you cannot replicate phenomena or something, then scientifically speaking, you haven't really got phenomena, right? You need to be able to see the same thing repeated in many different places to kind of validate and have these very same things being repeated by different people that have no direct connection with each other, so that it cannot fudge the system. So that's why sometimes we try to give you at least 2 different names in there so you can kind of connect and see that there is a starting point for us there. As a matter of fact, there's a lot more people who have written books about this, but these were some of the early ones, some of the most recognizable names. I should have totally mentioned this, but of course, this is not an exhaustive list of all the resources you're going to find there, right? First, because I don't have the capacity or the knowledge to do it. To be frank with you, I have not read all the stuff that's out there. And second, because it will be even more challenging and boring for you to sit through a very long list of things. And we want to be mindful of your time. I think this is almost like a appetizer buffet, right? We want to lay the table for you so that you can have some nibbles, some taste testing of different things, so you can find something that interests you. And hey, and if none of that interests you, that's very okay too. Can I be completely direct with you, and maybe it will come across a little rude, but I don't mean to. It's like, if I don't change your mind, which I don't want to do, it's not going to change my life, right? I am not going to feel any better whether you believe this or not. Just being completely honest, I just presenting the information. I will arrive at my own decisions much the same way I think you should arrive at your own decisions. It might so be that some areas might make sense to you and others you're like, no, right? And I'll tell you a little bit later as well about one of the areas that I'm not so keen about, but I won't tell you until after I told you. But I'm like, that's it, so we all have our tendencies, our interests and so forth, but I think what is really important here for us as we start to look into make or get close to our first break is to think about the process of what would it take? What would it take for us to be satisfied with the evidence in front of us, right? That's always a very interesting conversation that we may continue later, because some people seem to have already been satisfied by it and some people have not. And that's very okay. I mean, we see that in our world too with all different kinds of issues, right? We know people who still believe that we have not landed on the moon, right? And some people are very convinced that we have. We have people who believe the earth is flat, right? We also respect that very much. I personally don't think the earth is flat, because if the earth was flat, all the cats would have pushed everything off the corners, right? If you have cats, you know what I'm talking about, right? That's not very scientific. Nevertheless, it's the way I look at things, right? You're very welcome to look at things in a different way. But it's important for us to say that, because as we pick up on part 2 in a little bit, we'll present you with some more different areas. We're still going to talk about near-death experiences. We're still going to talk about instrumental transcommunication, and also talk about mediumship, and pick up the consequences of all this stuff if we're ready to go to step 2 of things. But to recap briefly, what we have heard about today is basically the premise that what if death is not the end, looking to the causes of suicide as well, because that directly affects how we look at death as well, and that it might be possible for us to perhaps gain a little bit more insight into how pain and suffering take place through the philosophy of Gautama, Buddha, and understanding how we tick, psychologically speaking, because we should always be thinking about this. And then we dove a little bit more into this whole idea of scientific proof. We started with some memory regression, and I should say first spontaneous memory recall. And then we're going to go into other areas and kind of come back in a little bit. How does that sound so far? I know that we are covering a lot of terrain here. I also know that I have a tendency to talk very fast. And so I will try to slow myself down. I'm doing my best. I get excited about this stuff, and I just kind of like, almost like a horse will take off. And we're off to the races. But I thank you for your patience. We'll take a little break, and we'll see you on the next session in a little bit. All right? All right.